Okay, all right. Welcome, guests. If you're watching this when it gets recently released, we are in our December 2024 episode. Our last one for the year, Bruce. This is it.
Yay, I think. Uh,
Yeah.
and hopefully 2025 will be a good year, please.
Whew, I know. Hopefully, I think if it's not going to be a good year, it'll definitely be a year of a lot of growth. I'll say that for sure. That's what I have to learn. You got to
Right, like
bring
the
those.
old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, our topic for today is misinformation and disinformation. We're definitely not going to be able to cover it all in our episode today, but just to be able to start talking about it. This is Bruce, I think you mentioned like how much of our world is saturated in misinformation, disinformation. Like we got stuff from the Russian state leaking stuff in the our politics in terms of misinformation in our politics that's scattered everywhere, and then just even the media misinformation, and then just even the stuff that we talk about when we do our VPSA messaging. Like I always tell clients, was like, be careful because this is really powerful, and you can use it for good and bad. You can be very persuasive with stuff like that. And then, of course, the other things that we know is like a lie can travel much faster than the truth. So I think that's kind of, if audience members can get into that frame of mind, what we're going to be trying to discuss today.
Yeah, and that line about a lie can travel faster than the truth was coined before the days of social media, before you could click your mouse and 50 million people would see your disinformation. It's gotten worse, and it's a complicated environment to try and operate in.
Yeah. Yeah. It actually reminds me of how before social media, like word would travel quickly through my family and the Cambodian community because we're a tight-knit community. I don't know how it would happen, but if I tell my mom something in about 30 minutes, the whole community would know. And I would be getting it back. It was like, how is that even possible? The math doesn't even work out in terms of how many people she's having to call and talk at the same time.
Well, that happens spontaneously, and I'm old enough to remember when activists had phone trees, where
Yes.
like when there was something you had to get out, one person was assigned to call 10 people, and each of them was assigned to call 10 people. It's much faster now, for better or for worse, often for worse. And I will say, this is something I've had some experience with over the years, both as a communicator and prior to that as a journalist, before I necessarily knew what I was doing as a combater of disinformation. But it's always challenging, but there are some things that you can learn. And maybe the place to start is that, people are often afraid that if you try and fight disinformation or misinformation, you're just going to amplify it. And I think the bulk of the evidence is that fighting misinformation can and often is at least somewhat successful. But you do have to be a little bit careful. And we can talk specifically about how to do that, because if you do it the wrong way, you can spread stuff that you don't want to spread. Um, and I'm not sure where to even start here. Although I will tell you, this is something I've been thinking about a lot because I'm working with some folks, some advocacy folks who are gearing up for some of what they expect to happen in 2025, a lot of which is going to have to do with misinformation, possibly coming from certain federal agencies, where I think they'll see a lot of, unfortunately, misleading nonsense. And I think one thing maybe to start off with, um, where there a technique that has some actual research behind it, which doesn't risk spreading misinformation at all, is what's sometimes called pre-bunking. Uh, Instead of debunking, getting in ahead of time and basically conditioning people to understand the way they could be manipulated, the way they could be misled, um, which is, of course, not difficult to do, particularly online on social media where people are just reading a headline, an image, maybe a 30-second video, um, and are not necessarily thinking deeply about it. Um, and so if you can get in there before the fact and alert people to what to watch out for, there is some actual research that shows that that can work, that people will then, people were shown a pre-bunking video and then shown something misleading, and they were less likely to believe the misleading stuff when they had been basically warned what to look out for.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I think that absolutely, I've seen that happen in my line of work as a community organizer. And so, like, one example that I could bring up was after I left Green Lining, I took a job with the Sierra Club. And then the Sierra Club, my job there was to help Team Richmond win their election against Chevron. So Chevron have poured in, I think, over $1.4 million into Richmond, and Richmond's a town of 100,000. I mean, 100, around 100,000 people, especially around that time. So it's like 1.4 million for 100,000 people. That just amounted to a saturation of political flyers and mailers and things like that. And
Excuse
yeah, you get there. You need some.
me, something in my throat. Sorry about that.
Yeah, you want to grab some
Survive,
water?
I promise.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So my first assignment was to help the current mayor now, Eduardo Martinez, with his campaign. So I would go walk with him, canvas with him, get a chance to know him. But before I did that, I found out one, he lived right down the street from me. So he was my neighbor. And then two, I had gotten a flyer and I wish I still had it. And it was Eduardo, and it was like a door hanger flyer, and they would called him an anarchist, like a big A. And they apparently found a Halloween photo of him dressed as Fidel Castro and used that and then talked about all these anarchist rhetoric and stuff like that. And it was, and then so you can so that was my first day on the job. The night before was you're going with Eduardo, and there I was looking at this door hanger where he's like called some radical anarchist.
So what did you do about that?
So I was like, well, I don't know what's gonna happen. And then the next morning, I get yeah, he comes and picks me up, and then I meet him, and Eduardo is the most lovable, sweet guy I've ever met. He was a former elementary school teacher. And he overcame a lot of his own challenges. But in when he was an elementary school teacher, he helped lead a walkout to get more resources for school. And then ever since then, he's always been a champion for the community, for Richmond, leading the charge against speaking out against Chevron and speaking out against police brutality, and just has done an incredible job. Has been in the council for a long time and is now the current mayor. He was the Sierra Club West County group leader at the time, so that's why I was assigned to him through the Sierra Club. So yeah,
So
just
he wasn't
complete.
actually an anarchist.
No, not an anarchist at all. He was a completely big time community guy, and it was very interesting. And to get back to your point, as a boomerang, because I promise it's not that much of a tangent. But what we decided to do, because there was so much of that type of political mailer, was to start to teach voters how to spot out on the mailer what it means, because we have laws that say in the mailer like who paid for it. And then so we were able to identify, like, this is how you identify, who paid for what type of mailer, how to look out for that. And that's exactly what you're talking about in terms of pre-bunking. You're
Right.
really being able to teach people like how to look out for misinformation.
Right. That's an important thing to warn people to look out for is who's behind something, who's paying for it, who has deep pockets and what do they have to gain?
Yeah.
Another thing that you can warn people about, and I dealt with this a lot when I was working on marijuana policy, was misuse of statistics. You'll see people a lot of the times. For example, one technique that you can call out and warn people about is confusing correlation or association with cause and effect. We would, for example, run up against government propaganda designed to scare parents by saying something like teens who smoke pot are 30% more likely to drop out of school. Now, that's scary, but it proves nothing. It could just as well be, it could be that smoking pot makes you drop out of school. It could also be that kids who are doing poorly in school and struggling and miserable all day want to take their minds off it when they get out of class. Um, the example I like to use was I woke up this morning and I made myself some coffee. And right after I did that, it started to rain. So clearly making coffee causes rain, right? Not really. So you can warn people about that sort of manipulation and hopefully arm them to be a little more skeptical. And some of what we had to do in those days was convince the press to be more skeptical because they were very used to just regurgitating the official government line, even when the government line didn't stand up to scrutiny.
Yeah, right. Right. Yeah. Just yeah. You get sometimes you gotta tell journalists to do their job. You can't just regurgitate and copy them.
Yeah, and that's a whole nother story about the care and feeding of reporters that we can talk about sometimes, because I do run into fellow advocates sometimes who try to do that in unhelpful ways. But that's another issue. But to circle back to what we were talking about before about how to debunk misinformation without spreading it too much or amplifying it is, I mean, there are a couple of things I think to think about. One is if you can avoid restating the misinformation at all, do it. Um, if you have to restate it for your argument to make sense, and sometimes you do, um, clearly debunk it definitively, completely at the same time so that it's not sitting out there by itself. And one technique that is really effective for doing that is what's sometimes called the truth sandwich, where you start by stating what is a fact, quickly acknowledge the bullshit you're trying to debunk, and then circle back to a really solid refutation of the misinformation. So, for example, um, you might say something like, the earth is round. This is not in question anymore. There are some people out there who will try and tell you the earth is flat, but in fact, we know from scientific observations, from satellites, from the photographs taken from space, from astronauts who've circled the earth, that the earth is in fact a sphere, no matter what they may tell you. So we started with the truth, we acknowledged briefly the nonsense, and then circled back to the not just a refutation, but how we know it, which is an important thing to do, is to give people, tell people where to look, where to find the truth, how you know what you're saying.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Truth sandwich, and I feel like that first layer of bread could also be like your own messaging. I think another equation to this is you have to have your own message too and your own narrative already set to go. So that way, if there is misinformation, it has to compete with your message, and at least you can start to communicate your message and then layer in that
Right.
truth.
Yeah, if you possibly can get out in front and beat the other side to the punch if you can, or at least be prepared for what's coming, so that you're not two steps behind. Again, the old line about the truth getting halfway around the world before the lie getting halfway around the world before the truth puts its pants on.
Mhm.
Well, sleep in your pants if you have to, so to speak.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is your warning right now to start thinking start thinking about pre-bunking whatever is going to come your way. Yeah. Yeah, really really good. Yeah, all right. So what else do you want to what's one more topic that we can discuss about? I think that was really great to go
So,
over.
well, one of the things that is hardest for me is, and I'm curious as to your thoughts about, is to what to do about the fact that in America at the end of 2024, a lot of people have sort of retreated into information bubbles, where they just hear and read and see what reinforces what they already believe, whether it's on social media in a Facebook group or on Truth Social or X, or by watching Newsmax and Fox News and OAN or whatever. And figuring out how to reach those people is a challenge for which I wish I had a good answer, and I'm not sure that I do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. I mean, I remember when I was growing up, it was always encouraged to be skeptical and think critically about all types of news information. And this was even before the internet, when information was like readily scarce. But now, yeah, I think it's one of the challenges of our time, and I think it's one of those things where it's not something that it's like one of those long-term investments in terms of just like, hey, look, you know, just telling everybody around you and just hopefully promoting a culture more of understanding like there's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of disinformation. And I think I've been seeing that more in terms of the digital world, in terms of where there's YouTubers now who are looking at different misinformation and just straight debunking them, and
Right.
those videos get lots of views. And so I think the public is starting to gain more conscious. And then also, I think there's also a misperception of the general public and the voting public, right? Where the voting public really does decide a lot of our reality, unfortunately, but there's a larger majority that don't vote, you know.
Right.
So it's always interesting because it's always hard to capture how they also receive information. And there is a lot of skepticism and critical
Right.
thinking. Just look at the COVID vaccine and how much skepticism and vaccine hesitancy came around that, and so yeah, so always, so I think it's there, and I think it's about continuing to do what I think what you're talking about in terms of pre-bunking. Yeah, but there are also the cases of the situations where they didn't get a chance to think about it ahead of time, and now you're, what's the saying? Shit up a creek
It's
without a
certainly
paddle.
it's certainly a challenge. Of course, if you have money, if you have resources, there are things you can do to sort of get around people's walls. If you can pay to put up billboards where people can't help but see it on the highway when they're driving to work, or pay for direct mail, that goes straight to their home and circumvents Fox News, you might be able to break through to some folks. But that requires a budget, and not everybody has a budget. One thing that you can think of that's sort of related to this is addressing different audiences. I think we mostly have been talking about the sort of addressing the broad public or the broad voters. Um, but sometimes you can reach people that those folks might be talking to. For example, back in my days as a reporter, I wrote a lot about health issues, including HIV/AIDS. Ended up doing this a bunch of articles in the late 1990s about the AIDS denialists, the people who insisted that HIV was harmless and AIDS wasn't even a real illness, which sounds completely crazy. But our good friend RFK Jr. has expressed some admiration for some of these folks, and they had quite a following in the late 1990s, particularly in San Francisco, where I lived. And I ended up writing some stuff for sort of general circulation publications, um, some of which kind of focused on stories. For example, people who had believed this nonsense become ill, begun to suspect that maybe what they'd been told was wrong, got on the antiviral drugs that they had been told to avoid by the denialists, and got better. Um, but I also wrote some things for a publication called AIDS Treatment News, designed to arm people like other advocates, HIV counselors, people doing, remote HIV testing at community health fairs and things, so that they would know what to say when people asked about this stuff. And those articles got a little deeper into the science, a little nerdier, tried to not use too much heavy, difficult vocabulary, but denser than you would write for a regular newspaper or website, to give folks the ammunition for those one-on-one conversations where they if they were told something that was false that somebody had heard, we could say, no, here's how we know that that's wrong. So, there are tactics like that you can use too in some circumstances, but it's a challenge. It really is.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like as you were describing it, it's almost like having to clear a whole bush with it. There was this retreat I went to, and one of the exercises we got like these little strong scissors, and then we had to cut through a berry bush. So those are not easy to cut through with some. When you were talking about that, that's what I felt like. And I felt like how much misinformation is just swimming around everywhere and having to combat that. It's like it's a lot of work. It can be really overwhelming. You have
It's hard, and people become entrenched in their beliefs and tend to believe things that reinforce them. And going back to the HIV denialists, I knew people who literally died insisting that what was killing them couldn't possibly be killing them. Um, so it's, obviously nobody ever got through to them. Reality didn't get through to them.
yeah.
So that's a cheerful note to end on. Sorry.
Well, let's recap it for audience members. I think this was a fantastic episode in terms of just having how to deal with misinformation and disinformation, especially as we go into the new year, 2025. You know,
Right.
so what did we learn today? Pre-bunking is good. Teaching people how to figure out what the misinformation is, trying to get advance of it. And what was the second thing? The truth
And
sandwich that you
truth
mentioned.
sandwich. Don't
Yep.
just repeat the misinformation, bury it in real facts.
Yeah, burying real facts and make sure you have your own messaging and narrative all tightly wound up. And then what was the third one that we just spoke about?
So, oh dear. I need more coffee. That's the third
Yeah.
one. Drink more coffee before
Yeah,
you start any of this.
yeah, drink.
But a couple things are, to whatever degree you can, plan ahead, be ready, have your ammunition together, and then think about tailoring your messages to different audiences, including people who can be trusted messengers to the folks you're trying to reach.
Yeah, yeah, you can survive it. And with some good techniques and tools, you can definitely overcome it. So, yeah.
All right.
All right, everybody. Take care. Have a good new year if you see this, if or whenever you see it.
Yes, we'll see you all in January.
All right.